Hi there. Welcome to NapTime History channel. Tonight we're standing in a torch-lit dungeon beneath Prague Castle, where the most feared man in the city, a man who's broken hundreds on the wheel and sent twice as many to the gallows, is backing away from his prisoner, hands trembling, refusing to do his job. The year is 1457. And you're watching Europe's most experienced executioner commit what amounts to professional suicide. Here's the twist that'll make you squirm. He's not afraid of the condemned man, or the armed guards surrounding him, or even the emperor's wrath. He's terrified of what touching this particular prisoner will do to his immortal soul, because sometimes there really are fates worse than death, and you probably won't survive learning why medieval executioners would rather die than harm certain people. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this community span the globe, keeping each other company through the night. All right, let's begin the story. You're living in medieval Europe, where executioners aren't just judicial employees. They're walking paradoxes, wrapped in black hoods and existential dread. These men inhabit a bizarre social limbo that would make modern HR departments spontaneously combust. By law, they must live outside city walls, marry only within their own profession, and enter taverns through separate doors marked with symbols of shame, yet kings and princes personally summon them, pay them handsomely, and grant them privileges that would make merchants weep with envy. You see them collecting taxes on market goods, running profitable side businesses in medicine. Yes, the man who breaks your bones also sets them, and wearing fine clothes that technically they're forbidden from wearing, but nobody dares challenge them about. The executioner's code isn't written in any single document you can point to. Instead, it's woven through centuries of guild regulations, whispered oaths, and traditions passed from master to apprentice like cursed heirlooms. In the German states, executioners swear upon their swords, not Bibles, notably to deliver swift, clean deaths according to the sentence prescribed. In France, the barreaux take oaths before city magistrates, promising to execute justice without favor or hatred. But buried in these formulaic pledges lies something darker: the unspoken rules about whom they cannot touch, encoded in metaphor and religious symbolism that'd make Dan Brown jealous. You might think executioners, being society's ultimate outcasts, would relish their power over life and death. After all, when you're already considered dishonest by birth, a medieval term meaning ritually impure, what's left to lose? But here's where medieval logic gets deliciously twisted. Executioners believe their souls dangle by a theological thread. Each execution potentially damns them, but the state's authority supposedly shields them from divine punishment. Think of it as cosmic qualified immunity. However, this protection comes with more asterisks than a pharmaceutical ad. Certain victims fall outside the state's power to absolve, and touching them means risking eternal damnation. No pension plan covers that. Historians still argue whether executioners genuinely believed in these spiritual consequences, or simply used religious concerns as leverage in professional negotiations. The University of Heidelberg's criminal justice archives contain letters from executioners demanding hazard pay for spiritually dangerous executions, which sounds like medieval workers' comp claims. One correspondence from 1489 shows Nuremberg's executioner haggling over a 20% surcharge for executing a defrocked monk, citing risk to my eternal soul, alongside more mundane concerns like the crowd might riot. The rules governing executioners reflect a society trying to reconcile necessary evil with Christian salvation. Imagine bureaucrats attempting to create loopholes in the Ten Commandments. You're looking at a world where killing is simultaneously a mortal sin and a civic duty, where the man who sends you to meet your maker fears meeting his own. These aren't just professional guidelines, they're survival tactics for navigating a spiritual minefield where one wrong swing of the axe doesn't just end a life, it potentially begins an eternity of suffering for the executioner himself. The moment a priest commits murder, you're watching medieval Europe's entire legal system short circuit like a computer trying to divide by zero. The church claims exclusive jurisdiction over its clergy through something called benefit of clergy, a get out of secular jail free card that makes diplomatic immunity look like a parking ticket. This isn't some minor clerical privilege. It's a fundamental pillar of medieval society that says ordained men literally exist in a different legal dimension from you and everyone else breathing regular air. You'd think being able to read would be a basic job requirement for priests, but medieval standards are refreshingly low. To claim clerical immunity, suspects merely need to read or memorize and convincingly recite Psalm 51 in Latin, earning it the nickname neck verse because it literally saves your neck from the noose. Clever criminals start memorizing Miserere mei, Deus, faster than modern students cram for finals. One London court record from 1463 describes a highway robber who read like a very parson and walked free, probably high-fiving his literacy tutor on the way out. The theology behind clerical immunity would make your head spin faster than Linda Blair in The Exorcist. Once ordained, priests receive an indelible mark on their souls. Think of it as God's own copyright protection that no earthly power can remove. This mark supposedly persists even if the priest murders, steals, or runs a medieval Ponzi scheme. Church lawyers argue that secular authorities judging clergy would be like your local DMV trying to issue tickets in heaven, completely outside their jurisdiction and cosmically embarrassing to attempt. But here's where it gets juicy. Church courts can't execute anyone. Their harshest punishment is life imprisonment on bread and water, which sounds rough until you remember the alternative is being broken on a wheel while crowds eat snacks and critique your screaming technique. So when Father Johannes stabs a merchant over a gambling debt, secular authorities want his head on a spike. The church insists on a stern talking to and dietary restrictions, and you're watching two power structures collide, like tectonic plates made of legal precedents and righteous fury. The practical implications create situations that'd make Kafka weep with recognition. You witness town guards arresting a priest for theft, only to release him the moment he flashes his tonsure. that distinctive haircut marking clergy. Executioners develop an almost supernatural ability to spot tonsures from a distance, the way modern cops can smell weed through 3 layers of Febreze. Some executioners carry measuring devices to check if suspicious haircuts meet official clerical specifications, turning judicial proceedings into the world's most morbid beauty pageant. Mainstream historians note that Henry II of England tried breaking this system after Archbishop Thomas Becket's murder in 1170, demanding clergy face secular justice for serious crimes. The church responded by literally making Becket a saint and guilt-tripping Henry into public flogging, medieval power moves that make modern PR campaigns look subtle. Fringe historical accounts suggest some regions developed secular tonsures, where criminals paid barbers to give them priest haircuts before committing crimes, though church authorities probably categorized this under, "That's not how any of this works. You're living in a world where your hairstyle determined which legal system prosecutes you," where literacy becomes a survival skill more valuable than swordsmanship, and where executioners must become part-time theologians just to know whom they're allowed to kill. The system works exactly as well as you'd expect when mixing temporal power, eternal damnation, and humans who've discovered this one weird trick judges hate. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities were genuinely paralyzed by religious conviction or just playing the world's longest game of jurisdictional hot potato, passing problematic priests between courts like toxic assets in clerical collars. The executioner's dilemma intensifies when you realize he's not just risking his soul in some abstract theological sense. He believes touching a priest during execution creates a spiritual contagion that follows him home. His wife can't receive communion. His children can't marry into respectable families. And local priests might refuse him last rites on his deathbed. It's social leprosy with eternal consequences, all because someone in a fancy robe decided that ordination creates a force field of legal immunity that extends into the afterlife. The summer of 1457 brings Prague the kind of scandal that makes town criers clear their throats and practice their dramatic pauses. Father Wilhelm Hauschka, respected priest of St. Vitus Cathedral, stands over the cooling body of Jacob Dvorak, master goldsmith, while blood pools around an ornate communion chalice, the murder weapon that gives this crime its particularly blasphemous flavor. You're watching as witnesses pour from nearby shops, finding the priest still clutching the chalice, muttering Latin prayers over his victim like he's conducting the world's most inappropriate last rites. The details that emerge during the investigation read like a medieval soap opera written by someone with serious theological anxiety. Dvorak had been commissioned to repair the chalice, a priceless relic supposedly blessed by 3 different saints, because medieval Prague doesn't do anything halfway. Father Wilhelm claimed the goldsmith replaced genuine gemstones with colored glass, pocketing the originals to fund his mistress's taste for imported silk. The confrontation erupted in Dvorak's workshop, where apprentices heard shouting about sacrilege and earthly greed before the distinctive sound of sacred metalwork meeting human skull ended the debate permanently. You might expect Wilhelm to flee, but here's where medieval privilege gets interesting. Instead of running, He calmly walks back to St. Godvitus, changes into his finest vestments, and begins hearing confessions like he hasn't just committed murder with liturgical equipment. When city guards arrive, he's mid-absolution with a young woman who later describes the surreal experience of confessing minor sins to a priest whose robes still show bloodstains. Wilhelm doesn't deny the killing. He frames it as defending church property from defilement, which in his mind apparently justifies cranial renovation via chalice. The Goldsmiths Guild demands immediate execution, presenting Emperor Frederick III with a petition signed in what they claim is Dvorak's blood, though modern historians suspect theatrical pig's blood was substituted for dramatic effect. The emperor, already dealing with Ottoman threats and Hungarian rebellions, now faces a murdered craftsman, a sanctimonious killer priest, and a legal system about to explode like a theological powder keg. Frederick does what any reasonable medieval monarch would do. He passes the buck harder than a quarterback with a broken offensive line. The Archbishop of Prague, George of Podobrady, finds himself in an impossible position. Refusing to surrender Wilhelm means defying imperial authority and potentially triggering the kind of church-state conflict that ends with excommunications flying like medieval missiles. But handing over an ordained priest to secular execution means admitting church courts can't handle their own problems, setting a precedent more dangerous than letting teenagers operate trebuchets. George stalls by initiating a church investigation that moves slower than modern DMV paperwork, interviewing witnesses in Latin to ensure maximum confusion and minimal progress. Meanwhile, Prague's executioner, Master Pavel, starts developing mysterious illnesses whenever Wilhelm's case comes up: chronic stomach pain, temporary blindness, sudden inability to grip his sword, symptoms that coincidentally vanish when discussing other condemned prisoners. You're watching a professional killer discover he has religious convictions at the most inconvenient possible moment. His apprentices report finding him praying at St. Vitus, in the very chapel where Wilhelm still conducts services, begging forgiveness for crimes he hasn't even committed yet. Historians still argue whether Wilhelm believed his own justification or simply played the holiness card with sociopathic precision. The University of Prague's medieval archives contain his written defense, a masterpiece of circular logic arguing that killing to protect church property isn't murder, but defensive salvation. He cites obscure church fathers, misinterprets canon law with creative enthusiasm, and basically invents a theological self-defense doctrine that would make modern stand-your-ground laws look restrictive. Fringe historians suggest he was angling for martyrdom, hoping execution would transform him from murderer to victim of secular oppression. The case drags through autumn into winter, while Dvorak's widow sells everything to survive, and Wilhelm continues his priestly duties like nothing happened. You're witnessing medieval justice at its most dysfunctional, a system so tangled in jurisdictional knots that a confessed murderer keeps counseling parishioners about their eternal souls while his victim's family slowly starves. The chalice itself disappears during the investigation, fueling conspiracy theories that persist in Prague's tourist guides today. though it probably ended up melted down by someone with more pragmatism than piety. Master Franz Schmidt sits in Nuremberg's execution chamber, reading the imperial decree for the third time, while his hands mechanically oil the hinges of the rack, a nervous habit that served him through 361 executions over 2 decades. The parchment bears Frederick III's personal seal, ordering him to apply questioning of the first and second degree to Father Wilhelm, transferred from Prague under heavy guard. You're watching the Holy Roman Empire's most renowned executioner, a man who's extracted confessions from hardened killers and witch-accused grandmothers alike. Realize he's been handed a spiritual death warrant with his own name on it. Franz isn't your typical hooded psychopath from Central Casting. He keeps meticulous records in a leather journal, noting each execution with the precision of an accountant, documenting tax receipts. His father held the position before him, passing down not just the tools, but the philosophical framework that lets a man sleep after separating heads from bodies all day. Franz considers himself a craftsman, takes pride in clean kills, and maintains his instruments like a samurai tending katanas. He even runs a successful medical practice on the side, because apparently medieval Nuremberg enjoys the irony of its executioner moonlighting as a healer. The order specifically demands Wilhelm endure peinliche Frage, painful questioning, a euphemism that makes enhanced interrogation sound honest. Franz knows exactly what this means. The strapado to dislocate shoulders, heated pincers for encouragement, and the boot that crushes ankles into bone pudding. He's performed these procedures hundreds of times on thieves, murderers, and accused heretics, but those were laymen, spiritual civilians, whose souls the state could authorize him to damage. This is like asking a demolition expert to blow up a building that might be load-bearing for the entire universe. You witness Franz drafting his response to the Emperor, each word chosen with the care of someone defusing a theological bomb. He doesn't refuse outright. That's treason, punishable by the very implements surrounding him. Instead, he cites precedent with the obsessiveness of a medieval lawyer who went to executioner school. He lists 14 cases where previous executioners were excused from handling clergy, dating back to Charlemagne's reign. He mentions the Executioners' Guild Charter of 1421, which explicitly forbids members from laying hands upon those marked by holy orders. He's building a legal fortress out of dusty precedents and professional standards, hoping bureaucracy can save his soul. The Emperor's response arrives within a week, lightning speed for medieval correspondence, suggesting someone really wants this priest tortured. Frederick's secretaries have crafted a masterpiece of imperial irritation, dismissing Franz's concerns with language that basically translates to "stop being such a baby about damnation and do your job." They note that Wilhelm has been degraded by church authorities, stripped of his priestly status, making him technically a layman. They conveniently ignore that theological debate rages about whether degradation actually removes the indelible mark of ordination or just covers it with spiritual whiteout. Franz faces a choice that would make Sophie jealous: defy the emperor and face certain execution, or torture a priest and face possible damnation. He takes a third option, that showcases why he's survived 20 years in a profession with the life expectancy of a Game of Thrones narrator. He announces he'll comply with the imperial order tomorrow. Then he develops the most conveniently timed illness in juridical history. Sudden fever, mysterious weakness, hands that shake too much to operate torture equipment safely. His wife swears to authorities that he's bedridden, though cynical neighbors note his recovery seems to coincide with mealtimes. Historians still argue whether Franz genuinely believed touching Wilhelm would damn him or simply played the system with magnificent cunning. His journal from this period contains cryptic entries. The wolf demands I hunt the shepherd, and my tools grow cold while my soul burns. Medieval German scholars interpret these as either profound spiritual crisis or Franz trolling future historians. Both seem equally plausible. Some fringe theorists suggest he was protecting professional standards, knowing that executing clergy would open floodgates to political executions disguised as criminal justice. What you're seeing isn't just one man's crisis of conscience, but an entire system groaning under contradictions. The emperor needs Franz more than Franz needs any individual execution. Trained torturers don't grow on trees, even medieval ones. Franz has calculated that he's irreplaceable enough to survive this standoff, betting his professional expertise against imperial wrath. It's a high-stakes game of chicken where the stakes include both temporal and eternal consequences, played by a man who understands that sometimes the most powerful action is refusing to act. The November morning, when imperial guards surround Franz Schmidt's house, you can practically hear medieval Nuremberg holding its collective breath. 40 armed men form a perimeter while their captain pounds on the door, delivering an ultimatum that strips away all pretense. Appear at the torture chamber within the hour or face immediate arrest for treason. Franz emerges wearing his executioner's hood, not from tradition, but to hide what his wife later describes as tears streaming down his face. You're watching a man walk to his own spiritual execution while neighbors peer from behind shuttered windows, placing bets on whether they'll need a new executioner by nightfall inside Nuremberg's justice complex. The scene resembles a medieval Mexican standoff with extra religious anxiety. Wilhelm sits chained in the torture chamber, still wearing remnants of his priestly vestments despite official degradation, a detail that makes Franz's hands shake visibly. The imperial commissioner, Baron von Steinberg, occupies a raised platform like he's directing dinner theater in hell. 20 guards line the walls, hands on sword hilts, ready to enforce compliance or prevent escape. The torturer's apprentices hover near the implements, clearly torn between professional duty and not wanting to catch whatever spiritual plague their master fears. Franz enters and does something unprecedented in his career. He kneels, not to the Baron, not to the guards, but directly on the torture chamber floor, beginning to pray in Latin loud enough for everyone to hear. He's performing spiritual theater, reminding every witness that this isn't just another Thursday afternoon stretching session. The Baron orders him to rise and begin, but Franz continues praying, moving through the Pater Noster with the deliberate pace of someone billing by the hour. Guards shift nervously, attacking a praying man. Even an executioner, carries its own theological complications. When Franz finally rises, he approaches the rack with movements so slow you'd think he's underwater. He examines each component like he's never seen torture equipment before, testing straps that he personally maintained yesterday, adjusting wheels that need no adjustment. The Baron's patience frays like cheap rope. "Begin the questioning," he shouts. But Franz has discovered another delay. His tools are missing, the special pincers, the precise implements required by law, nowhere to be found. How convenient that Franz is the only one who knows where he keeps them. You witness bureaucratic rage reaching critical mass as the Baron threatens Franz with immediate execution. Franz responds with a counteroffer that showcases massive theological balls. He'll proceed, but only if the Baron personally hands him each torture implement and verbally orders each specific action. He's trying to transfer spiritual liability like a medieval insurance adjuster, making the Baron complicit in every scream Wilhelm might produce. It's brilliant, forcing the Emperor's representative to either share the metaphysical risk or admit the whole enterprise might damn everyone involved. The standoff continues for 3 hours, longer than most actual torture sessions. Franz finds new objections. The chains need replacing. The brazier isn't hot enough. The positioning violates guild regulations. He's filibustering with professional standards, while guards grow increasingly uncomfortable. Some later report feeling suddenly ill, though whether from genuine divine intervention or contact embarrassment remains unclear. The apprentices have long since fled, claiming various urgent appointments that definitely don't involve avoiding spiritual contamination. Historians still argue whether the guards' reluctance stemmed from religious fear or professional sympathy. The captain of guards, Heinrich Müller, later testified that his men experienced strange reluctances and spiritual disturbances when ordered to force Franz's compliance. Modern scholars note that executioners and guards often shared drinks at the same taverns, albeit through different doors, creating professional bonds that transcended social boundaries. When push came to shove, literally, the guards discovered they preferred not shoving the man who might one day be professionally obligated to shove them off a scaffold. Fringe accounts suggest Franz had prepared for this moment, bribing or persuading key guards beforehand. One dubious chronicle claims he threatened to curse anyone who forced him to torture a priest, wielding his liminal status between life and death like a spiritual weapon. Whether guards believed an executioner could actually curse them or simply wanted plausible deniability for not manhandling a respected professional, the result was the same. Nobody wanted to be the guy who physically forced Franz to start cranking the rack. The chamber becomes a tableau of medieval paralysis. Wilhelm watches from his chains with what witnesses describe as either serene faith or smug satisfaction. Franz stands beside instruments of torture he refuses to touch. The Baron fumes on his platform, authority evaporating faster than water on those heated pincers. Guards study their boots with sudden fascination. You're seeing the entire apparatus of state power grind to a halt because one man with a very specific job refuses to do it. And then everyone else realizes they're not quite willing to make him. Long before Wilhelm's blood dried on that golden chalice, Churches across Europe had been playing the world's most serious game of tag, where touching base meant immunity from earthly justice. You're looking at a tradition stretching back to Constantine the Great, who decided in 315 AD that Christian churches needed legal sanctuary rights because apparently regular architecture wasn't holy enough. The concept exploded across medieval Europe like a viral TikTok trend. If TikTok were run by bishops and trending topics included avoiding dismemberment, the rules governing sanctuary make modern international law look straightforward. Cross the threshold of any consecrated church, and you instantly become untouchable for 40 days. Think of it as medieval witness protection administered by priests instead of federal marshals. During this grace period, you negotiate with authorities, arrange safe passage into exile, or hope everyone forgets why they wanted to hang you. Some sanctuaries, like Westminster Abbey and Durham Cathedral, offer permanent protection, creating criminal retirement communities that would make Florida blush. You witness the bizarre spectacle of cathedral closes, the areas surrounding churches becoming medieval Switzerland. Neutral zones, where murderers attend morning mass next to their victims' families at Beverly Minster. The sanctuary boundaries extend a full mile out from the church, marked by stone crosses that might as well read, "Cops stop here." The closer you get to the altar, the stronger your protection. Touch the altar itself, and you've basically achieved legal invincibility, though you also can't leave without losing it, creating the world's holiest prison. But here's where medieval logic performs its signature backflips. Not all crimes qualify for sanctuary. Treason against the king, no dice. Sacrilege within the church itself, ironically disqualifying. Highway robbery? Depends on which highway and whose interpretation of canon law you prefer. The system spawns an entire legal subspecialty of lawyers arguing whether specific crimes occurred on consecrated ground, like medieval GPS attorneys. Your Honor, my client's stabbing occurred the 3 inches outside the baptismal font's spiritual jurisdiction. The economic impact would make modern city planners weep. Merchants avoid establishing shops near churches, knowing any debtor can sprint to sanctuary faster than you can say, "Payment due." Some entrepreneurial spirits set up food stalls just outside sanctuary boundaries, creating the medieval equivalent of food trucks for fugitives. Others run messenger services, carrying negotiations between sanctuary seekers and authorities who can't physically enter churches without committing mortal sins and career suicide simultaneously. Enforcement creates situations that belong in Monty Python sketches. You see sheriffs standing at church doors, reading warrants to empty air while wanted criminals make rude gestures from windows. Some authorities try smoking fugitives out with strategic bonfire placement, technically not violating sanctuary while making it uninhabitable. Others employ the waiting game, posting guards in shifts like the world's most patient siege warfare. The record stands at Durham, where officials waited 7 years for a sanctuary seeker to emerge, only to discover he'd died of old age 3 years prior. Historians still argue whether sanctuary rights represented genuine religious conviction or pragmatic social pressure valves. The University of Oxford's medieval law archives contain thousands of sanctuary claims, ranging from legitimate political refugees to common thieves who happen to know their catechism. Statistical analysis shows sanctuary claims spike during harvest season and tax collection, suggesting some viewed churches as seasonal crime bases. Meanwhile, theological debates rage about whether God's house should shelter killers or whether divine justice demands earthly accountability. The clergy themselves occupy impossible positions, forced to provide food and shelter to people who might have murdered their parishioners last week. Some priests embrace the role enthusiastically, seeing sanctuary as divine mercy incarnate. Others comply grudgingly, marking time until the 40 days expire, like medieval hotel managers with the worst possible guests. A few creative clerics interpret sanctuary rules liberally, accidentally leaving church doors unlocked during prisoner transfers or forgetting to refill the holy water that marks protective boundaries. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from your last Egyptian history lesson? Well, medieval sanctuary seekers develop equally creative solutions for long-term church living. They construct elaborate pulley systems for receiving supplies without leaving consecrated ground. They dig tunnels between churches, creating underground sanctuary networks that anticipate subway systems by centuries. One persistent legend tells of a forger who spent 12 years in Westminster Abbey, running a document falsification business from the crypt until authorities finally negotiated his exile to France, where he presumably upgraded to fancier churches. Archbishop George of Podobrady arrives in Nuremberg wearing enough ecclesiastical bling to fund a small crusade, his entourage carrying documents that make the Magna Carta look like a post-it note. You're watching the church deploy its biggest diplomatic guns, transforming Franz's torture chamber standoff into a theological summit where the agenda items include eternal damnation and who exactly owns which souls. George doesn't come alone. He brings 3 bishops, a small army of canon lawyers, and enough incense to fumigate the entire Holy Roman Empire. The Archbishop opens negotiations with a move that would make Machiavelli take notes. He doesn't defend Wilhelm or deny his crimes. Instead, he questions whether the empire has jurisdiction to even hold this meeting. He produces papal bulls dating back 4 centuries, each one confirming that clergy exist in a separate legal dimension where imperial warrants are basically fancy toilet paper. The Baron counters with his own documents, creating a battle of competing paperwork that makes modern legal proceedings look swift and decisive. You witness medieval power politics performed like kabuki theater with higher stakes. George publicly examines Wilhelm, still chained, but now wearing a fresh cassock the Archbishop personally provided. The questioning occurs in Latin, ensuring most guards understand nothing while creating an aura of sacred mystery. George asks about Wilhelm's spiritual state, his repentance, his prayers for Dvorak's soul. He's performing last rites on Wilhelm's secular legal existence, transforming a murder trial into a redemption narrative faster than streaming services reboot franchises. The real negotiations happen in private chambers where wine flows freely and threats dress in diplomatic language. George hints at potential excommunication for anyone participating in Wilhelm's torture, not just Franz, but the Baron, The guards, their families, their dogs, possibly their houseplants. The Baron responds by suggesting the Empire might reconsider various church tax exemptions, maybe investigate some conveniently overlooked monastery land grants. They're playing nuclear deterrence with salvation and property rights, while Franz continues his one-man work stoppage in the torture chamber. Here's where George reveals his masterstroke. Wilhelm has already been tried by ecclesiastical court and sentenced to life imprisonment in a remote monastery. The Archbishop produces documentation showing the trial occurred yesterday. Impressive speed for an institution that typically moves like molasses uphill in January. The sentence includes perpetual penance, dietary restrictions that would challenge vegans, and copying religious manuscripts until his fingers fall off. It's harsh by church standards, but laughable compared to being stretched on a rack until your joints sound like bubble wrap. The Baron protests this obvious circumvention of imperial justice, but George has precedent locked and loaded. He cites the Concordat of Worms, the donation of Constantine, still believed genuine in 1457, and enough canonical decisions to fill a library. His lawyers argue in circles that would make modern filibusters look linear, essentially claiming that trying Wilhelm in secular court after church sentencing constitutes double jeopardy, a concept that won't formally exist for centuries, but sounds impressive in Latin. Historians still argue whether George genuinely cared about Wilhelm's soul or simply refused to let secular authorities create precedent for trying priests. Contemporary accounts describe the archbishop as perspiring with righteousness, though whether from spiritual conviction or political maneuvering remains unclear. His personal correspondence reveals careful calculations about which battles to fight. He'd already surrendered 2 defrocked priests to secular justice that year for crimes he considered insufficiently theological to warrant protection. The intervention creates a cascade of complications. Other imprisoned clergy across the empire suddenly remember they've been tried by ecclesiastical courts that definitely existed and certainly kept records that unfortunately burned in fires that may have occurred. Bishops dust off ancient precedents, discover new interpretations of canon law, and generally make life miserable for secular authorities trying to prosecute clerical criminals. The Wilhelm case becomes a template for church resistance. Studied in seminaries like modern law students analyze Supreme Court decisions. You watch the Archbishop deploy his final argument. If the empire executes Wilhelm despite church sentencing, George will place Nuremberg under interdict. No masses, no sacraments, no Christian burials, spiritual sanctions that would turn the city into a ghost town faster than economic collapse. Merchants can't conduct business without oath-taking. Couples can't marry. And dying without last rites means potential damnation. He's threatening to turn off the medieval equivalent of electricity and internet simultaneously, betting the Baron won't risk economic and spiritual catastrophe over one murderous priest. The Executioners Guild of the Holy Roman Empire guards secrets that would make Freemasons look like open-book oversharers. You're accessing knowledge passed down through generations of professional killers, whispered in tavern backrooms and coded into seemingly innocent craft regulations. These aren't just trade tricks for sharper axes or smoother hangings, they're spiritual insurance policies, mystical protocols for men who walk the knife's edge between divine justice and damnation every working day. The initiation ceremony for new executioners reads like something between a Catholic Mass and a pagan ritual that got lost and asked directions from a lawyer. Apprentices swear oaths on a blade that's shed righteous blood. Though nobody explains how blood becomes righteous versus regular murder, they promise to bear the burden of necessary sin and stand between the living and the judged. Phrases that sound profound until you realize they're basically accepting cosmic liability for state-sanctioned killing. The ceremony culminates in the new executioner receiving his hood, blessed by a priest who definitely didn't ask too many questions about why he's sanctifying murder accessories. You discover the guild's most closely guarded secret, the executioner's prayer, a Latin invocation that supposedly transfers guilt from executioner to the state that ordered the killing. Members recite it before each execution, a spiritual hot potato game where everyone tries not to be holding damnation when the music stops. The prayer's exact wording remains secret. Guild members who revealed it faced expulsion and mysterious accidents that definitely weren't orchestrated by colleagues protecting trade secrets. Modern scholars who've pieced together fragments describe it as theological gymnastics that would sprain a Jesuit's brain. The physical talismans executioners carry would stock a medieval occult shop, a splinter of the true cross worn next to the heart, because nothing says, "I'm doing God's work," like wearing pieces of Christianity's most famous execution device, blessed salt in leather pouches to sprinkle on contaminated ground. Saints' medals specifically chosen for their connection to justice or martyrdom, Saint Barbara for protection against sudden death, Saint Damas, the good thief, for favorable divine judgment, Saint Jude for hopeless causes, which pretty much covers the executioner's entire spiritual situation. But here's where guild knowledge gets properly weird. The blood ledger. Every executioner maintains a record of each life taken, not for administrative purposes, but as evidence for their eventual divine trial. They believe St. Peter personally reviews these ledgers at heaven's gates, checking whether each execution followed proper protocols. The ledgers include victims' last words, signs of repentance, unusual occurrences during execution, anything that might sway celestial court proceedings. Some executioners hire scribes to illuminate their ledgers like prayer books, apparently hoping God appreciates good presentation. The guild develops elaborate protocols for avoiding spiritual contamination when executing clergy. Members share techniques like using intermediary tools, pulleys, and weights that technically kill without direct hand contact. They experiment with execution methods where gravity or mechanical failure delivers the fatal blow, turning themselves into cosmic legal technicians, exploiting loopholes in divine law. One master executioner in Bavaria designs a guillotine prototype 2 centuries early, not for efficiency, but to maximize spiritual distance between himself and victims' deaths. Historians still argue whether these practices reflected genuine belief or collective psychological coping mechanisms. The University of Vienna's Guild archives reveal correspondence between executioners discussing theological minutiae with the passion of seminary students. They debate whether left-handed executions carry different spiritual weight. If executions during religious festivals count double against their souls, and whether botched executions that require multiple attempts multiply or divide divine culpability. It's theology filtered through professional anxiety and occupational hazard. Secret signs and symbols let executioners recognize each other across linguistic and regional boundaries. A specific way of crossing themselves, particular tavern calls, coded phrases worked into casual conversation, an entire shadow culture existing within but separate from mainstream society. They share warnings about jurisdictions where clergy executions have been ordered, essentially creating a medieval union blacklist for spiritually dangerous jobs. Some regions can't find executioners at any price once word spreads that local authorities expect them to handle ordained victims. Remember that mysterious illness Franz developed? Guild medical knowledge includes an impressive pharmacopoeia of herbs and techniques for simulating symptoms that prevent work without actually dying. Executioners share recipes for temporary paralysis, convincing fevers, and spectacular rashes that disappear once dangerous assignments pass. They've turned malingering into an art form backed by enough medical knowledge to fool university-trained physicians. After all, when your profession involves detailed anatomical knowledge and access to interesting substances, faking illness becomes surprisingly straightforward. Spain's Inquisition faces a problem that would make even Torquemada sweat through his Dominican robes. How do you burn heretics when executioners believe touching condemned clergy damns their souls? You're watching the Spanish church-state hybrid develop the auto da fe, a theatrical spectacular that makes Wagner operas look understated. The genius lies not in the pageantry, but in the bureaucratic shell game that shifts spiritual responsibility around like a three-card Monte dealer working the gates of heaven. The ceremony begins before dawn with processions that transform city squares into open-air cathedrals of judgment. Condemned heretics wear sambanitos, yellow robes decorated with flames, devils, and helpful illustrations of their pending fate. Like medieval spoiler alerts, you see platforms erected with viewing boxes for nobility, vendors selling refreshments, and families bringing picnic lunches because watching religious persecution apparently works up an appetite. It's part revival meeting, part public execution, part community theater, where understudies definitely don't want their big break. Here's the brilliant loophole that lets everyone sleep at night. The Inquisition doesn't technically execute anyone after hours of sermons, confessions, and last-minute conversion attempts. The Church relaxes condemned heretics to secular authorities. That's literally the term, relaxation, like they're sending them to a spa instead of a stake. The inquisitors wash their hands more thoroughly than Pontius Pilate, declaring they've merely determined heretical status, not ordered deaths. What secular authorities do with that information is totally their business. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, burn, burn. The handoff ceremony deserves an Oscar for Best Supporting Hypocrisy. Inquisitors formally request secular authorities show mercy and avoid bloodshed, knowing full well that refusing means facing their own heresy charges. Secular judges then condemn relaxed heretics to burning, carefully noting they're executing civil law against disturbers of public order who coincidentally happen to be heretics. The executioner, following orders from secular rather than church authorities, technically isn't killing clergy, but civil criminals who forfeited clerical protection through heresy. It's murder laundering that would make money launderers take notes. You witness executioners developing their own adaptations within this system. Many refuse direct contact even with relaxed clergy, using long poles to push condemned onto pyres or employing assistants for hands-on work. Some hire professional coal arrangers who technically light fires for warmth that accidentally happen to have heretics tied above them. Others insist condemned must walk themselves onto pyres, avoiding physical contact entirely. The mental gymnastics required could qualify as an Olympic sport if the Olympics included events for avoiding eternal damnation through technicalities. The Portuguese variation adds another layer when executioners simply refuse participation entirely. Lisbon's auto de fe of 1451 nearly cancels when no professional will touch relaxed clergy despite secular authorization. Authorities resort to conscripting criminals already condemned to death, offering commutation in exchange for lighting pyres. You're watching condemned murders become executioners of condemned heretics. A spiritual hot potato that presumably cancels out somehow in divine accounting. The results are predictably unprofessional, fires that burn poorly, botched ceremonies, and one memorable incident where a conscripted arsonist accidentally sets fire to the viewing platform. Historians still argue whether participants genuinely believed these elaborate workarounds satisfied divine law or simply agreed to collective delusion. The University of Salamanca's Inquisition records show extensive theological debates about the spiritual implications of various execution methods. Does burning differ spiritually from hanging? Can demons enter executioners through smoke from burning clergy? If an executioner converts to Judaism mid-auto de fe, do previous executions count against his Christian soul or his Jewish one? These aren't theoretical discussions. They're practical concerns for professionals navigating unprecedented theological territory. The economic impact ripples through Spanish society as experienced executioners migrate to regions without active inquisitions. Cities hosting regular autos de fe struggle to maintain professional standards as executioners develop convenient illnesses, urgent family obligations, or sudden callings to distant pilgrimages. Wages for willing executioners skyrocket while quality plummets. Some jurisdictions resort to rotating executioners from distant towns, creating a traveling circuit of reluctant professionals who perform their duties and flee before spiritual contamination sets in behind the ceremonial smoke and theological mirrors. You see a system straining against its own contradictions. The church wants heretics dead, but won't accept blood on its hands. Secular authorities want to appear pious while maintaining public order. Executioners want steady employment without eternal consequences. The auto de fe becomes a carefully choreographed dance where everyone performs their role while pretending the music isn't a funeral dirge. It's community theater, where the special effects include actual burning flesh, and the reviews determine your eternal fate. The French solution to executing troublesome clergy arrives wrapped in enough ceremony to make Versailles jealous, introducing the degradation ritual that strips priests of holy orders like a cosmic court martial. You're watching the Gallican Church, perfect spiritual bureaucracy, creating procedures that transform ordained men into executable laymen through the power of paperwork and theatrical humiliation. It's the medieval equivalent of revoking someone's driver's license, except the vehicle is their immortal soul, and the DMV is staffed by bishops with axes to grind. The degradation ceremony unfolds in cathedral chapters across France, with the precision facons of a Swiss watch made of shame and Latin. The accused priest stands before assembled clergy wearing full vestments. Every layer of sacred clothing that marked their ordination now becomes a prop in their spiritual demotion. Bishops read charges in sonorous tones, while scribes document every detail. Because if you're going to damn someone, you'd better keep good records for the inevitable appeals to Rome. You witness the systematic stripping that follows, each garment removed with specific prayers that essentially unbless the wearer. First, the chasuble, symbol of charity, yanked off with words that would make charity itself weep. Then the stole, representing immortality, apparently returnable with proof of purchase. The alb of purity gets pulled away, while everyone pretends not to notice the irony of removing purity from someone about to be executed for murder. It's reverse ordination, performed by clerics who look like they'd rather be literally anywhere else, including possibly hell. The most disturbing part comes when bishops scrape the priest's fingers that once consecrated the Eucharist, using special knives to remove holy oils that supposedly seeped into the skin during ordination. They shave his tonsure, eliminating the haircut that marked him as God's property. Some ceremonies include burning the removed vestments, sending smoke signals to heaven that this particular employee has been terminated with extreme prejudice. The degraded priest stands before them in secular clothes, theoretically just another layman who happens to know a lot about transubstantiation. But here's where French legal innovation gets creative. The declaration of irregularity, even after degradation. Executing former priests requires special dispensation acknowledging their irregular status. They're not quite laymen, not quite clergy, spiritual limbo dancers existing in a legal gray zone. Executioners demand written confirmation that degradation took, like checking if hair dye properly covered those gray roots. Some request witnesses to swear they saw the ceremony completed properly, creating the world's most depressing notary service. The Archbishop of Paris develops a degradation certificate that executioners can present at heaven's gates like a hall pass for necessary murder. These documents include elaborate seals, multiple signatures, and enough whereas clauses to make modern legal contracts look concise. They essentially state, this man was definitely a priest, but isn't anymore because we said special words and removed his fancy clothes. So killing him probably won't damn you. Signed, Management. Executioners frame these certificates, presumably hoping wall decoration impresses divine judges. Historians still argue whether anyone believed degradation actually worked or simply appreciated the plausible deniability. Canon lawyers debate endlessly about the indelible mark of ordination. Can human ceremony truly erase what God has marked? The University of Paris produces thousands of pages analyzing this question, generating academic careers built entirely on theoretical soul mechanics. Meanwhile, practical administrators just want someone to execute problematic priests without triggering spiritual labor strikes among executioners. The system spawns unintended consequences that would amuse anyone who's worked in bureaucracy. Priests facing serious charges suddenly discover vocations for missionary work in conveniently distant lands. Others claim their ordinations were invalid due to technicalities. The bishop was secretly Protestant. The holy oil had expired. They had their fingers crossed during vows. French courts spend decades litigating whether specific ordinations took, turning sacraments into legal proceedings that make patent disputes look straightforward. You see executioners developing expertise in theological assessment, examining degradation ceremonies for procedural errors that might invalidate the spiritual demotion. They become canon law experts by necessity, arguing fine points of ecclesiastical procedure with the passion of seminary students who minored in not wanting to be damned. Some maintain correspondence with theologians, seeking opinions on whether particular degradations meet minimum standards for soul safety. It's professional development driven by existential terror, producing the world's most reluctant religious scholars. Remember those elaborate pulley systems from sanctuary churches? Degradation ceremonies inspire similar mechanical innovations as bishops try to minimize contact with condemned priests. They develop special vestment removal tools, consecrated tongs for handling corrupted clergy, and procedures for degrading priests without technically touching them. The French Church becomes a workshop for spiritual engineering, creating Rube Goldberg machines for unmaking priests while maintaining everyone's plausible deniability in the afterlife's court system. Tudor England approaches the clergy execution problem with characteristic English pragmatism. If you can't execute priests without damning souls, simply redefine who counts as a priest. You're watching Henry VIII transform from defender of the faith to defender of creative loopholes, engineering solutions that would make modern tax attorneys weep with professional admiration. The dissolution of monasteries provides convenient cover for developing new frameworks where troublesome clergy mysteriously transform into treasonous laymen faster than you can say annulment. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 creates a beautiful catch-22 that Joseph Heller would appreciate. Refuse to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. That's treason. And traitors aren't protected by clerical immunity because treason supersedes ordination. Accept Henry's supremacy? Congratulations. You're part of a church that doesn't recognize Roman ordinations, making your priesthood as valid as a monopoly deed. It's theological checkmate played with real heads rolling across Tower Hill. You witness the execution of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, which becomes the test case for England's new approach. Henry solves the bishop problem by having Pope Paul III conveniently make Fisher a cardinal while imprisoned, then arguing this foreign appointment constitutes treason. The executioner still hesitates until presented with legal documents explaining that Fisher isn't being executed as a bishop, but as a traitor who happens to wear funny hats. The logic requires squinting, but the axe falls just the same. Thomas More's execution showcases the full English treatment. Here's the former Lord Chancellor, layman technically, but everyone knows his real crime involves refusing to bend theology around Henry's marital adventures. The executioner receives special instructions emphasizing More's secular status. Repeated so often, it sounds like someone protesting too much. Witnesses report the executioner whispering prayers before the strike, suggesting even Tudor legal creativity can't entirely ease professional consciences. The truly innovative solution comes with the development of civil clergy, priests who serve the new Anglican Church and therefore fall under civil jurisdiction by definition. They're simultaneously clergy for spiritual purposes and civil servants for legal ones, existing in a quantum state that collapses into whatever's most convenient for authorities. Executioners find this classification helpful since executing government employees carries no special spiritual penalties, even if those employees happen to consecrate bread on Sundays. But Henry's masterstroke involves the retrospective discovery that various executed clergy were never properly ordained. Amazing how many ordination records mysteriously disappear or reveal disqualifying irregularities when examined closely. That priest you need executed, turns out his ordaining bishop was invalidly consecrated due to a technicality nobody noticed for 30 years. It's administrative murder with plausible deniability, turning archive management into a lethal weapon. Historians still argue whether Tudor executioners genuinely believed these legal fictions or simply appreciated the political cover. The Tower of London's execution records show increasing amounts of documentation for clergy executions, pages of legal justification for what previously required a simple warrant. Executioners begin demanding written opinions from canon lawyers, creating the world's most morbid filing system. Some refuse to proceed without multiple authorities, confirming the condemned's non-clerical status, turning execution grounds into impromptu law libraries. The economic incentives align perfectly with theological flexibility. Executioners who adapt to the new system receive bonuses, choice appointments, and protection from both royal displeasure and potential damnation. Those who hesitate find themselves replaced by more theologically flexible colleagues. The message spreads through professional networks. Ask fewer questions about ordination validity. Collect more execution fees. It's salvation through selective blindness, professionally enforced. You see the ripple effects spread through English Christianity like theological tsunami. Priests hedge their bets by obtaining multiple ordinations from different bishops, hoping at least one remains valid if political winds shift. Some carry forged degradation certificates, preemptively declaring themselves laicized to avoid execution complications. Others maintain dual identities, priest by day, definitely not priest when arrested. The system creates a generation of shape-shifting clergy whose status depends entirely on who's asking and why. Remember the blood ledger mentioned earlier? English executioners develop special sections for disputed clergy, recording extensive justifications for why each condemned technically wasn't ordained. They cite legal opinions, theological arguments, and royal proclamations with the thoroughness of doctoral candidates defending dissertations. These ledgers become masterpieces of rationalization, documenting not just deaths, but the mental gymnastics required to make those deaths spiritually acceptable. Future executioners study them like case law, learning which arguments successfully transformed priests into executable laymen. Constantinople, 1821. Ottoman executioners faced their own theological crisis when Sultan Mahmud II orders the execution of Patriarch Gregory V on Easter Sunday, timing that would make even the most flexible moral compass spin like a possessed compass. You're watching Islamic executioners grapple with killing a Christian holy man during Christianity's holiest day, creating an interfaith diplomatic incident that makes modern religious tensions look like minor scheduling conflicts. The executioner's response showcases how professional standards transcend religious boundaries when eternal consequences enter the equation. The backstory reads like a Byzantine political thriller because, well, Byzantine politics never really left Constantinople. Greek independence movements have been using Orthodox churches as revolutionary headquarters, technically making the Patriarch complicit in treason against the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mahmud, already dealing with Janissary revolts and provincial uprisings, decides to make an example that'll echo through every church dome from Athens to Moscow. He orders Gregory hanged from the gates of the Patriarchate itself. Location, location, location for your political murder theater. You witness the extraordinary scene as the Sultan's executioners arrive at the patriarchal complex on Easter morning, finding Gregory in full ceremonial vestments, having just completed the Paschal liturgy. The lead executioner, Kara Ali, stands frozen in the courtyard while Orthodox faithful stream past, many still carrying blessed candles from the service. His assistants whisper among themselves in Turkish, their usual professional confidence evaporating faster than morning dew in the Anatolian sun. The Islamic jurisprudence complications pile up like theological Jenga blocks. Executing dhimmi, protected non-Muslims, requires specific authorization, but executing their religious leaders during high holy days enters uncharted spiritual territory. Ottoman executioners traditionally show respect for people of the book, often allowing final prayers and ensuring bodies receive proper burial. But hanging a patriarch on Easter, that's like scheduling a bar mitzvah during Ramadan in a Hindu temple. Nobody's scripture covers this scenario. Kara Ali sends urgent messages to the Sheikh-ul-Islam, seeking religious guidance that might preserve his soul while satisfying the Sultan's wrath. The response arrives with impressive speed, but disappointing clarity. The execution is legally permissible, but spiritually inadvisable. It's the kind of non-answer that makes lawyers rich and executioners nervous. Meanwhile, Greek Orthodox crowds gather outside, creating a human shield of faithful that adds riot control to the executioner's expanding list of concerns. The Ottoman Executioners Guild, yes, they have one too, convenes an emergency meeting in a coffee house near the Grand Bazaar. Members debate whether executing Christian clergy carries the same spiritual penalties as killing Muslim religious leaders. They consult Greek executioners who work for the empire, seeking precedent from professionals who share their trade but not their faith. The consensus emerges. Nobody wants to test whether Allah and the Christian God compare notes on who killed whose clergy. Historians still argue whether the executioner's reluctance stemmed from genuine religious respect or pragmatic concerns about Greek uprising. Contemporary Ottoman records describe unusual hesitation and procedural delays that stretched the planned dawn execution past noon. The executioners demand written orders specifying that Gregory be executed as a political traitor, not a religious leader, familiar bureaucratic protection for the spiritually cautious. They also insist on using Greek Christian assistants for the actual hanging, creating layers of theological insulation. The execution finally proceeds with modifications that showcase interfaith anxiety. Kara Ali oversees, but doesn't personally touch Gregory. Greek assistants handle the physical execution, while Ottoman guards maintain order. The patriarch's last words, "I die for my faith and my nation," get carefully recorded in multiple languages, presumably for whatever cosmic court reviews these cases. The body hangs for 3 days before being given to Jewish merchants for disposal, adding another religious dimension to an already complicated spiritual transaction. You see the aftermath ripple through Ottoman execution practices. Executioners across the empire become notably reluctant to handle Christian clergy, developing convenient scheduling conflicts when such executions arise. Some claim religious visions warning against killing priests of any faith. Others discover sudden vocational callings for less spiritually hazardous professions. The Sultan's response involves importing executioners from distant provinces who haven't heard about Constantinople's Easter complications. The Gregory execution becomes a cautionary tale shared in executioner circles from Istanbul to Cairo. Professional networks spread warnings about the spiritual dangers of interfaith clergy executions, complete with embellished accounts of Kara Ali's subsequent misfortunes, though he actually lived another 20 years and died peacefully. Facts rarely interfere with good cautionary tales. The incident reinforces universal executioner wisdom. When multiple gods might be watching, better to call in sick than risk multidimensional damnation. Throughout history, some executioners did break the ultimate taboo and execute clergy, and the consequences read like cautionary tales written by collaboration between Stephen King and Thomas Aquinas. You're exploring the dark archives where professional executioners who crossed this line met fates that made their victims' deaths look merciful. These aren't just stories of legal punishment, but of men who believed they'd damned themselves and proceeded to live or die accordingly. The case of Hans Reichardt in Augsburg, 1523, provides the template for executioner self-destruction, forced at sword point to behead a Franciscan friar accused of sedition. Hans completes the execution, but immediately begins what witnesses describe as spiritual disintegration. He stops eating, claiming food tastes of ash and blood. He sees the friar's face in every reflection, hears Latin prayers in the wind, feels invisible hands clutching his throat while sleeping. Within 6 months, Hans throws himself from the same scaffold where he executed the friar, leaving a note that simply reads, "He waits for me." Whether supernatural punishment or psychological breakdown, the result remains equally dead. You witness the spectacular unraveling of the Nuremberg executioner's dynasty in 1541. Meister Leonhard, pressured by Protestant authorities to execute an allegedly corrupt Catholic priest, performs the hanging but refuses payment. The first sign something has broken inside. His execution techniques deteriorate rapidly. Previously clean beheadings now require multiple strokes. Hangings result in slow strangulation, and crowds notice his hands shake uncontrollably. His son refuses to inherit the position, breaking 5 generations of family tradition. His wife leaves him, claiming he speaks to invisible presences and weeps blood, probably metaphorical, but medieval record-keeping leaves room for interpretation. The Venetian incident of 1598 showcases institutional collapse following clergy execution. The executioner, Giovanni Battista, nicknamed Il Monaco for his habitual prayer, garrots a priest convicted of poisoning a rival. The execution proceeds flawlessly, too flawlessly. Giovanni performs with mechanical precision, showing none of his usual pre-execution anxiety. Observers later describe his movements as puppet-like and his eyes as empty windows. He continues executing with inhuman efficiency for exactly 40 days, matching Christ's desert trial, before walking into the Venetian lagoon and disappearing. His assistant refuses to take over, claiming Giovanni still appears at the scaffold, invisible to all but those who share his profession. In Scotland, 1612, the executioner, known only as Black Donald, provides history's most dramatic example of immediate consequence. Compelled to hang a Presbyterian minister during religious conflicts, Donald positions the noose, pulls the lever, and drops dead himself as the trapdoor opens. Witnesses swear they heard 2 necks snap simultaneously. Medical examination finds no apparent cause of death. Donald simply died, as if his life force was mysteriously connected to his victims. His successor lasts 3 executions before fleeing to Ireland, claiming Donald's ghost assists with every hanging, steadily tightening invisible ropes around the living executioner's neck. The Spanish case of Pedro Mendoza, 1634, demonstrates how clergy execution could destroy entire bloodlines. Pedro executes a pest convicted by the Inquisition, technically legal but spiritually hazardous. His eldest son dies within a month from sudden fever. His second son drowns in a well. His daughter enters a convent, claiming she must pray continuously for her father's soul. Pedro himself develops stigmata-like wounds that resist all medical treatment. Bleeding whenever church bells ring, he dies on Good Friday, his last words reportedly being, "Every day, I burn with him." The Mendoza family exits the execution business permanently. their tools donated to the church as cursed relics. Historians still argue whether these consequences represent divine punishment, psychological breakdown, or convenient cover stories for executioners wanting career changes. Contemporary records mix medical observation with supernatural interpretation, making it impossible to separate fact from faith-based fiction. What's undeniable is the pattern. Executioners who killed clergy rarely prospered, often died mysteriously, and invariably served as warnings to their colleagues. The stories spread through professional networks faster than plague, each retelling adding dramatic details that reinforced the central message. The French executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, who would later execute Louis XVI, recorded in his memoirs his grandfather's advice: kings and commoners, nobles and thieves, all are equal beneath the blade, but a priest, that blade will turn in your hand and seek your own neck. This from a dynasty that executed thousands without apparent qualm, suggesting even the most professionally hardened recognized boundaries they dared not cross. The Sanson family developed elaborate rituals for avoiding clergy executions, including strategic illnesses and convenient equipment failures. You see these stories functioning as professional mythology, creating protective taboos through terror. Whether executioners faced divine punishment or psychological implosion matters less than the effect. Widespread refusal to execute clergy, maintaining spiritual boundaries even in history's most violent periods. The breaking points, those who did execute clergy, served as reinforcement, their fates warning others that some professional obligations weren't worth accepting regardless of earthly pressure. The Enlightenment arrives like a theological wrecking ball, swinging through centuries of sacred protections with the momentum of reason and really good coffee. You're watching French philosophes and their European colleagues dismantle the spiritual framework that kept executioners terrified of touching clergy, replacing divine judgment with social contracts and supernatural consequences with natural law. It's intellectual disruption that makes modern tech startups look conservative, except the product being disrupted is the fear of eternal damnation. Voltaire leads the charge with his trademark wit, writing pamphlets that essentially ask, if God wanted priests immune from execution, wouldn't he make them bulletproof? His treatise on tolerance includes satirical calculations of how many angels can dance on a scaffold, mocking the theological gymnastics that prevented justice for criminal clergy. You see Enlightenment salons where aristocrats debate whether executioners' souls face more danger from killing priests or from reading Diderot's encyclopedia, both apparently threatening traditional salvation. The shift happens gradually, like watching ice melt in reverse time-lapse. Secular universities begin teaching law without mandatory theology prerequisites, producing judges who view crime through social rather than spiritual lenses. New legal codes emerge that conspicuously omit clerical exemptions, treating ordained criminals like any other lawbreakers with fancy outfits. The Holy Roman Empire's patchwork of ecclesiastical immunities faces standardization pressure from rulers who've discovered centralized authority works better than negotiating with every bishop who thinks his cathedral is a sovereign nation. You witness executioners' attitudes evolving from paralyzing fear to professional indifference. The grandson of an executioner who once faked plague to avoid touching a priest now bills the same rate for clergy as merchants. Professional journals, yes. Executioners develop trade publications, begin discussing optimal techniques for clerical executions with the same detachment as comparing rope suppliers. The spiritual terror that defined the profession for centuries evaporates like morning dew under the rational sun. The French Revolution crystallizes this transformation with characteristic subtlety, which is to say, none whatsoever. The civil constitution of the clergy doesn't just reduce clerical privileges, it transforms priests into state employees, subject to the same laws as postal workers. When the revolution decides to execute bishops and priests en masse, executioners queue up for overtime pay rather than fleeing to avoid damnation. Charles-Henri Sanson, who inherited warnings about clergy execution destroying bloodlines, processes ordained victims with assembly line efficiency, supposedly commenting that the machine recognizes no distinction of color, but here's where Enlightenment logic meets medieval muscle memory. Many executioners still feel something, not the bone-deep terror of damnation, but a vestigial discomfort, like phantom pain from an amputated superstition. Some develop pre-execution rituals that look suspiciously like secularized prayers. Others insist on specific procedures for clergy that technically have no legal basis but make everyone feel better. You're seeing rationalism with religious residue, like finding holy water stains on a laboratory beaker. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment truly eliminated executioners' spiritual fears or simply drove them underground. Private letters from period executioners reveal ongoing anxieties expressed in newly secular language. Instead of fearing hell, they worry about psychological disturbances and professional reputation. The vocabulary changes, but the midnight sweats remain remarkably consistent. Some executioners' guilds maintain traditional restrictions on clergy executions, but justify them as maintaining professional standards rather than avoiding damnation. The secularization process varies wildly across Europe. Italian executioners cling to religious protections decades after their French colleagues abandon them. German states create elaborate compromises where clergy can be executed, but only after secular ceremonies that definitely aren't degradation rituals, just happen to involve removing religious symbols and saying specific words. English executioners, always practical, develop a sliding scale where executing Anglican clergy carries less spiritual weight than Catholics. Theological nationalism at its finest. You see the final gasps of the old system in places like Spain and Portugal, where executioners still refuse clerical executions into the 1800s, but they're swimming against the secular tide. Professional dinosaurs, in an age that's decided God either doesn't care about jurisdictional disputes or doesn't exist to care. Young executioners mock their elders' superstitions while secretly wondering if maybe, just maybe, there's something to the old warnings. It's the same impulse that makes modern rationalists knock on wood, intellectual certainty with primitive insurance. The transformation completes not with dramatic pronouncement, but gradual indifference. By the 19th century, executing clergy becomes administratively identical to executing anyone else. Same paperwork, same procedures, same lack of cosmic consequences. The fears that paralyzed medieval executioners seem quaint, like worrying about sailing off the earth's edge, yet something remains lost in this rational triumph, the sense that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, that professional efficiency shouldn't override every human hesitation, that maybe a little sacred terror serves purposes beyond superstition. Modern execution chambers still echo with medieval hesitations, though today's executioners frame their refusals in psychological rather than theological terms. You're discovering that some professional boundaries transcend centuries, dressed in contemporary language, but rooted in the same deep discomfort that made Franz Schmidt fake illness rather than torture a priest. The vocabulary evolved, but the resistance remains remarkably consistent. Humans tasked with ending lives still find certain lives harder to end than others. The case of Donald Hocutt illustrates modern executioner anxiety. In 2000, this Mississippi executioner resigned rather than execute a death row inmate who'd become an ordained Buddhist priest during an incarceration. Hocutt didn't cite fear of karmic retribution or Buddhist hells. He simply stated he couldn't do it and walked away from a job he'd performed for 12 years. The official records mention personal reasons, but colleagues reported Hocutt saying the prisoner's religious transformation made the execution feel different in ways he couldn't articulate. Medieval executioners watching from beyond would recognize that inexplicable reluctance. You witness contemporary protocol adaptations that mirror ancient anxieties. Several U.S. states now use execution teams where no single person knows who delivers the fatal drug, multiple syringes, one real, others saline, administered simultaneously. It's the firing squad blank cartridge principle applied to lethal injection, creating plausible deniability for conscience. The official reasoning involves psychological protection for staff, but the structure eerily resembles medieval executioners using mechanical devices to avoid direct contact with condemned clergy. Different century, same desire for moral distance. The Japanese system showcases institutional avoidance. When Shoko Asahara, leader of the Aum Shinrikyo cult and self-proclaimed holy man, faced execution in 2018, the process took years longer than comparable cases. Officials cited complex legal issues, but prison staff reported unusual reluctance among execution team members. Several requested transfers. Others developed stress-related illnesses requiring extended leave. The execution finally proceeded, but only after essentially recruiting an entirely new team. Modern Japan recreating medieval patterns of executioner refusal without religious framework. In Iran, the execution of Sunni clerics creates complications within the Shia-dominated justice system. Executioners have reportedly refused direct participation, leading to increased use of public cranes operated by construction workers rather than professional executioners. It's theological outsourcing that would impress medieval guilds if the executioner won't touch clergy. Find someone who isn't technically an executioner. The spiritual loophole logic remains consistent across centuries. Only the technology updates. You see modern executioners developing secular rituals that serve ancient purposes. Some refuse to look condemned prisoners in the eyes, officially to maintain professional detachment. But the practice particularly intensifies with prisoners who found religion. Others insist on specific procedures for religiously active inmates, allowing extended final prayers, ensuring religious items are handled respectfully, permitting spiritual advisors unprecedented access. These aren't legal requirements, but professional customs that emerge spontaneously, suggesting some boundaries transcend written law. The psychological studies reveal what medieval executioners knew intuitively. Killing someone who represents transcendent values, even in a secular context, creates unique moral injury. Modern executioners report higher rates of PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide when their victims include religious leaders, peace activists, or those who've undergone dramatic spiritual transformations. The correlation holds across cultures, suggesting something fundamental about human psychology rebels against executing those who embody sacred values, whatever sacred means in local context. Historians still argue whether modern executioner reluctance represents vestigial superstition or recognition of moral complexity. The clean narrative says Enlightenment rationalism freed executioners from medieval fears. But the messy reality shows professionals still struggling with boundaries between justice and sacrilege. Today's executioners might not fear hell, but they fear something, call it conscience, psychological damage, or professional integrity. The specific theology disappeared, but the human recognition that some acts carry special moral weight remains stubbornly persistent. As we drift towards sleep on this journey through centuries of professional refusal, you've witnessed the constant thread. Those tasked with society's ultimate sanction consistently recognize limits to their mandate, from Franz Schmidt's convenient illness to Donald Hocut's resignation. Executioners demonstrate that some boundaries transcend law, culture, and time. They remind us that professional duty has limits, that human conscience can override institutional demands, that even in our most necessary evils, we maintain space for the sacred, however we define it. The moon has traced its path across the night sky while we've explored these shadows of history. Your breathing has likely deepened, your mind drifting between waking attention and approaching dreams. These stories of executioners who refused, who recognized limits even in limitation's ultimate profession, offer strange comfort. They suggest that humans instinctively protect certain boundaries, that some hesitations serve purposes beyond understanding, that in our darkest professional moments we still reach for light, even if we can no longer name its source. Let these tales of principled refusal carry you into peaceful sleep, reminding you that throughout history, in ways both rational and mysterious, humans have found reasons to stay their hands when conscience called louder than authority. Sweet dreams. And thank you for joining me tonight in exploring the shadows where duty will be met its limits.